going to cover chapter 18 for a little bit. I want to start on chapter 18 so we can get a little bit further in the semester. Again, if you have questions, please ask. I can't, as I said, make you ask questions, but if you have them, ask. It's the only way sometimes that you will get to the correct answer of what you need. So please ask away. Don't feel bad. If you have the question, you're probably not the only one. There's probably 3 other people there that have that exact same question. Okay, so please ask away. You can either send me an email, write it in the chat. You can just interrupt me as we talk. I'll hear you and I'll put you in. So please ask questions as we go through these slides if you have them. All right, so let's talk then about chapter 18. So chapter 17 kind of ends our discussion of money. What chapter 18 and 19 do is we're going to open back up the economy. So remember in chapter 13, right, when we're talking about savings and investments, we closed the economy. The economy became closed. What we're going to do in chapter 18 and 19 is we're going to open this sucker back up. The problem is when we open the economy back up, it's going to make things more difficult, right? Because remember, we make assumptions to make the world easier. When we start to peel back those assumptions, things become more difficult. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to peel back assumptions. So this is going to make our discussion of savings and investment entirely more complicated. But as we have grown into a bigger world, we need to talk about open economies. So we're going to talk about flows of goods and assets. We're going to talk about real and nominal exchange rates. And we're going to talk about something that we call purchasing power parity. If you look at any economic statistics for countries, you will see purchasing power parity. Usually you see this PPP. And we're going to talk about how it explains exchange rates, especially nominal exchange rates. So a very, very important part of this chapter is to make sure that you understand the definitions. It's probably what hangs students up most in this chapter is that the definitions and the terminology is a little bit interchangeable and a little bit different than what you're used to. So sometimes students struggle, especially with questions on quizzes and tests, because the terminology is a little different than what they expect or know. So please go through the book. If you look at the first couple of chapters, there's probably 15 or 16 words highlighted in black. Please go through and make sure you know the definitions of everything. Because we often talk about trade deficits. Well, what is a trade deficit? Well, that simply means the amount of country imports is greater than its exports. Sometimes we call that a negative net exports. Okay, we call those different things. A trade surplus would be a positive net exports. Right? That's where exports are greater than imports. We could call it balanced trade. And that's the same as net exports equal to 0. Trade balance, that's the same as net exports. We'll talk about how assets flow across countries. The terminology we're going to use is something called net capital outflow. And then we're going to talk about exchange rates. So please make sure you understand the definitions and what these terms mean. So we talked about what a closed economy is. I don't interact. Open. I'm up and running. I buy and sell goods. Capital assets such as stocks and bonds move across the markets as we can save money not only in my country, but I can save money in other countries that these other countries can use to buy investment for their country. So I kind of gave you some quick definitions here. These aren't all of them, but please make sure you go through them. Make sure you know what those terms mean and can understand them. Exports we usually write as a capital X. Imports are actually written as a capital M. So what affects net exports? So how do I determine whether a country exports or imports more or less? This is going to make a big difference when we talk about chapter 20, but we're going to talk a little bit about it today. So what changes net exports? Well, that depends on what we call consumers' taste for foreign and domestic goods. During the COVID pandemic, what actually happened in some countries is we had less taste for sometimes foreign goods. We didn't want goods from China. Again, whether it's rational or not is not the economist's responsibility or job. Our goal is to say, hey, people don't want stuff from China anymore. So how is that going to affect net exports? Well, if our taste for Chinese goods decreases, net exports will increase, right? If imports are going to go down, then exports can rise. Because I'm no longer going to buy my goods from China, I might buy them from the United States, assuming that's an option. Prices will affect net exports. Remember, it's going to affect quantity. Right? So my quantity of exports or quantity of imports may go up or down based on prices. It's not only the price of the goods, but also the indirect prices through the exchange rate, which we'll talk about later. Also, how well a country is doing. If we are growing in the United States and have more income, well, I'm not only going to have more income to buy goods from the United States, but I might also buy goods from Italy or Europe or Germany. So as I get more money, I'm going to demand more of everything, and that includes imports. Transportation cost. How easy and how cheap or expensive it is to transport goods and services. If it becomes expensive to transfer goods and services, I'm going to transfer less of them or transport. So if the price of oil goes up, makes it more expensive for me to transport my goods, then I'm going to transport less of them. So that has an impact on net exports. And finally, government policies. How easy it is for governments to allow countries to trade. Is that if it make it very difficult to trade, well, net exports might decrease. If it's easier to trade, net exports might increase. So we have this issue of how do government policies affect exports? So let's look at the U.S. economy. Most of the time when we talk about the U.S. economy, we usually start sometime a little bit after World War II. So remember, World War II ends in the 40s. So usually we start either the late 50s, early 60s. That's when we look at what happened in the U.S. economy. So what we have here is this red line. So in the 60s, give or take about 4% of GDP was imports. So about 4% of our economy was made up of imports. And exports made up about 5%. So we add those two together, about 9% of the U.S. economy was based in trade. Let's fast forward to today. So exports today at least they were in 2015, was about 12%. Imports are, what is that, 15%? So today, the U.S. economy, about 27% of the U.S. economy is based in trade. So in the 60s, it was 9%. Today, it's closer to about 27. So some students will quickly go, well, trade's increased by 3 times the amount, right? 27 divided by 9 is 3 times. No, trade has increased by significantly more than 3 times the amount. Probably from 60 to 2015, the U.S. economy grew at about 3% a year. So 72 divided by 3 is 24. So that means in 48 years, about the time period, we've doubled twice. So what happens is we've got 3%, 3 times as much trade, and the economy has grown by about 4 times. So trade in the United States from the 60s to today has grown by almost 12 times the amount. These are rough estimates. This is not perfect math. It's just to kind of give us an idea of how big trade has gotten. So in the 60s, say trade was $1. Today, that would mean trade would be somewhere around $12. Add a million, add a trillion to that. And those numbers become very, very big, very, very quickly. And in fact, you probably can add trillions to it. So our expansion into trade has grown significantly, which is why we talk about open economies now. Why we, as in the College of Business, require you to take international business. Is we have, as a country, expanded our opportunities and expanded what we do. And trade's a big deal on that. So part of our job as educators is to make sure you understand that there is this huge change in trade as the world has become more international. So if you look at the US number, our trade as a percentage of GDP is 27%. If you were to compare us to the rest of the world, we're in fact actually low. Since we're a relatively big country that's relatively self-sufficient, we don't have nearly the percentage of our GDP based on trade as other countries. If we were in Europe, those countries average around 100%. So a lot of their economy is based even more on trade compared to the US. So for there, those majors are even more popular. Well, because they are dealing with international business a whole lot more. So these kind of things make ways in what we should learn as not only individuals, but how it affects education and why we start to introduce different ideas and concepts. And if we were taking econ in the 60s, we didn't probably need to talk about open economies as much. But we're taking econ in the 2020s, where it's a greater percentage of our economy, so we need to discuss more of the impacts of international trade. So not only do we trade goods and services, but also we trade assets. And one of the ways we trade assets or count for assets is called net capital outflow. So net capital outflow, by definition, is the purchase of foreign assets by domestic residents. So that's the foreign direct and foreign portfolio investments that we do in other countries, minus what other countries do in the United States. So if a US company takes US savings and goes and builds a factory in Mexico, that's called foreign direct investment. They're taking savings from the United States and going to Mexico to build an asset, to build a factory. If I decide as an individual I want to save my money into a Mexican company, That's foreign portfolio investment. That's me saving into stocks and bonds, which that company then uses to build a factory in Mexico. But it's the Mexican company that's doing it. But they're using domestic savings. They're using U.S. savings in Mexico. The other end is if the U.S. is using foreigners' savings to increase our assets. So kind of as a quick definition, if NCO is positive, that's an outflow. That means actually more capital is leaving the country than is coming in. If it's less than zero, it means there's an inflow of capital. Just kind of a list of things that affect net capital outflow. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about those. What we do care a lot about with net capital outflow is this identity. So what you need to make sure you pull out of Chapter 18 is this identity. That the net capital outflow of a country equals its net exports. Why? Because every transaction done is going to affect either net exports and or net capital outflow. So on Monday, we're going to go through an example and talk about when a foreigner purchases a good from the United States. What's the change in exports? What's the change in net capital outflow? Then we'll go back the other way. All right, are there any questions about Chapter 18 then for today?